If you'd like to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 8, verses 13 and 14 is what we will read tonight. We are studying the prophecy of the ram and the male goat. This is the fifth and last part of this prophecy, and it does concern the 2,300 days. Reading at verse 13, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Now the vision, what Daniel actually saw, ends at verse 12, the verse just before this. What we have now is a discussion concerning the 2,300 days. We considered what the 2,300 days are not in our very first lecture. We learned that some Bible scholars in the past interpreted the 2,300 days as 2,300 years, which they did in an attempt to show that this prophecy of Daniel actually predicted their church movement, which it does not. As we study the language in verse 14, we also found that the English word days is not the literal translation of the Hebrew words. And I say words because there are more than one word that is translated days here. And it actually should be translated as evenings and mornings. So it's not correct to say 2,300 days. It is correct to say 2,300 evenings and mornings. Of course, days is the same thing, but it's a reason why it is stated as evenings and days. Now, it's interesting, the Revised Standard Version actually has the best rendering of verse 14 in the English language. And it goes this way, "And he said to him, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Okay, you will recall that it said it would be cleansed. Well, the real meaning behind that is it will be restored to its rightful state. And this rendering clears up some ambiguities and states exactly what the Hebrew means. The 2,300 days are 2,300 evenings and mornings. And the cleansing of the sanctuary means that it is to be restored to its rightful state. Evenings and mornings, besides being the actual meaning, is necessary in this prophecy because in verse 11 it is said that the little horn would take away the daily sacrifices, which, as all Bible students know, were performed every evening and morning in the temple. We read in Exodus 29, verses 38 through 41, where this sacrifice was put in place. Now, this is what you shall offer on the altar: 2 lambs of the first year, day by day, continually. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. With the 1 lamb shall be 1/10 of an ephah of flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin pressed oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. And the other lamb you shall offer at twilight, and you shall offer with it the grain offering and the drink offering as in the morning, for a sweet aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord. That is what is under consideration here. Now, notice that although the vision has ended, before Daniel can say or do anything, 2 voices immediately are engaged in a short conversation. So the question comes, who are these voices? Daniel describes them as holy ones. The King James Version calls them saints. Daniel does not write that he saw these holy ones. He only heard them speaking. There is no record of their appearance that can give us a positive identification of these holy ones. But it stands to reason that these holy ones are angels. We do not know why their presence is made known exactly at this moment, but it seems logical that they have been close to Daniel while he was seeing the vision. Or it could be that they had been sent by the person identified as the appearance of a man, who shows up in verse 15 and commands Gabriel to explain the vision to Daniel. Now, we know that this appearance of a man is actually Christ. We studied that earlier. Christ has been the real reason for all of the prophecies up to this time. And it is safe to conclude that he has been in charge of giving all of these prophecies to Daniel all along. One thing we do know for sure, one of these holy ones asks a very important question. How long will this desolation last? The other holy one gives the answer, 2,300 evenings and mornings. It is interesting that that information is given only at this point in the prophecy and nowhere else in the chapter. And it's interesting that this comes from one of these holy ones, and it isn't the angel Gabriel that tells us about the 2,300 days. I just find it interesting. I don't know that it's pertinent to anything, but it's just interesting to me. So, what are the 2,300 days? This is the time period from Epiphanes' command to set up the pagan altars in the temple to the victory over Nicanor by Judas Maccabeus at the Battle of Beth Horon. In 1 Maccabees chapter 7, verses 36 through 43, we read about this. Then the priest entered in and stood before the altar in the temple, weeping and saying, Thou, O Lord, didst choose this house to be called by thy name, and to be a house of prayer and a petition for thy people. Be avenged of this man and his host, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies, and suffer them not to continue any longer. So Nicanor went out of Jerusalem, and pitched his tents in Beth Horon, where an host out of Syria met him. But Judas, that's Judas Maccabeus, pitched in Adasa, and 3,000 men, and there he prayed, saying, O Lord, when they that were sent from the king of the Assyrians blasphemed, thine angel went out, and smote 185,000 of them. Even so, destroy thou this host before us this day, that the rest may know that he hath spoken blasphemously against thy sanctuary, and judge thou him according to his wickedness. So, the 13th day of the month Adar, the host joined battle, but Nicanor's host was discomfited, and he himself was first slain in battle. So who was this Nicanor fellow? Nicanor was a Syrian Seleucid general under Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the general in command of the army that happened to be located there at Beth Horon. This particular battle was fought on the 13th of Adar in 161 BC. Okay? When, then, was the command given by Epiphanes to set up the pagan altars? It was given on the 15th of Kislev in 167 BC. Remember, when BC 167 comes before 161. So, the question is, how many days were between the 15th of Kislev in 167 BC, and the 13th of Adar in 161 BC. We'll look at a little chart here to give us the answer. Kislev is actually the 9th month of the Jewish year. Okay? From the 15th of Kislev to the end of Kislev was 15 days. The next month of the Jewish calendar is Tevet, 29 days in Tevet. The month following that is Shevat. There are 30 days in the month of Shevat. And then comes the month Adar. There are 29 days in the month of Adar. You have to keep in mind that the Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar. It went by the phases of the moon. So months either had 29 or 30 days. So in an entire Jewish year, there were only 354 days. We calculate our calendar based on the Earth's rotation around the sun, which it takes 365 days for the Earth to make a complete orbit around the sun. So that means there is a difference of 11 days between a Jewish year and an actual year. All right? So for the remainder of 167 BC, there were 2 additional days. All right, we come down to 166 BC, the entire year, Jewish calendar, 354 days. We need to add 11 days for the solar calendar. 165 BC, another 354 days, another 11 solar days. 164, again, to 63, 62, to 161 BC, to the 13th of Adar, was 337 days. And so there were actually 3 more solar days up to the 13th of Adar. So, the time from the desecration of the temple under Epiphanes to the defeat of Nicanor were 2,210 Jewish days. But we have to add 60 days to come up with the actual year. So the actual number of days was 2,270 days. So there were a total of 2,270 days from the setting up of the pagan idols to the defeat of the Seleucids at Beth Horon. Now keep in mind, Judas Maccabeus was out in the battlefield. He was located at another town that was some distance away from Beth Horon. It required about 30 days for the Jews under Judas Maccabeus to return to Jerusalem after the battle. Thus, we have the 2,300 days of Daniel's prophecy. That's all you need to show all that. So, we have the actual 2,300 days required by the prophecy in verse 14. So we need to notice that it was important for us to realize that the Holy One did not say the temple would be cleansed in 2,300 days. He said, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. There's a difference in the meaning of the language. The language as given by the angel does not require the cleansing of the sanctuary exactly on the 2,300th day. The language implies that the 2,300 days will transpire, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. In other words, sometime after the 2,300th day. While the Battle of Beth Horon gave the Jews victory over the Seleucids on the 13th of Adar, 161 BC, which was 2,270 days after the initial defiling of the sanctuary. It did require about 30 days for the Jews to return to Jerusalem. After the victory over Nicanor, Judas began the process of cleansing the sanctuary. This process took some time, as you can imagine. Remember, we looked at what happened, how the temple was gutted and idol altars were set up and things of that nature. You just couldn't go in with a vacuum cleaner and cleanse the sanctuary in 15 minutes. It took some time. So he began by reinstating the Jewish priesthood. He then set up the temple furniture wherever it had been placed. And then he reconsecrated the temple on the 25th of Kislev. That day is still celebrated by the Jews. It is celebrated as the festival of Hanukkah. So Hanukkah celebrates the restoration of the temple. There is a tradition that when the menorah was put in there and lit, that it continued to be lit for 8 days without having oil put in it. And that's why the Jews have a festival that lasts 8 days at this time they call Hanukkah. So after the conversation between the two holy ones, Daniel saw one having the appearance of a man who gave instructions to Gabriel to explain the vision to Daniel. We've already identified this appearance of a man to be Christ. As Gabriel begins to explain the vision, he tells Daniel that the vision refers to the time of the end. The vision is not about the end of time. It is about the time of the end, and there is a big difference. The vision is about the end of the events that are pictured in this vision. This is the close of the succession of empires consisting of the Babylonian, the Persian, and the Greek empires as seen in this particular vision. The closing out of this succession gives way to the coming of the Roman Empire, during which time Messiah would come. So this vision is essentially the ending of one dispensation and clearing the world scene for the opening of another dispensation. The time when the kingdom would be transferred from the Jews to the Messiah. As the chapter continues, Gabriel explains the meaning of the ram and the male goats, as we have already learned, specifically identifying them as the Persians, or as it's called in our Bible, the Medes, and the Greeks, the ram and the he-goat. In verses 22 to 25, Gabriel talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, revealing things about his character, the destruction he would bring, his defiance of the God of the Jews, and also of his end, which in verse 25 is said, "But he shall be broken without human means." About this, the classic commentary of Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown says, Antioch attempted to take vengeance for the defeat of his armies by the Maccabees, but he died a horrible death from worms and ulcers. His death was sudden and decisive, and was brought about by the hand of God, not man. So Antiochus Epiphanes was not killed in battle. He was not assassinated. He was devoured by worms. Isn't that interesting? In the New Testament, we see a king devoured by worms. Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. Okay? It's interesting, that little horn had a son whose son is devoured by worms. In this prophecy, we have a little horn himself who is devoured by worms. In other words, don't mess with God. In verse 26, Gabriel tells Daniel to seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. The events shown to Daniel in this prophecy were about 300 years in his future. While they might prove a curiosity to anyone with whom he would share them, they would be of no value to them because they are things that would happen long after their lifetime. Matthew Henry writes about this: the charge given to Daniel to keep it private for the present. Shut thou up the vision. Let it not be publicly known among the Chaldeans. Remember, that's the Babylonians. And that's where Daniel is when he has this vision. He is still in Babylon. He is still serving the king of Babylon. So don't let it be publicly known among the Babylonians, lest the Persians, who are now shortly to possess the kingdom, should be incensed against the Jews by it, because the downfall of their kingdom was foretold by it, which would be unseasonable now that the edict for their release was expected from the king of Persia. What he's saying here is, the history that we know is that after the Persians defeated the Babylonians, the Persians let the Jews go back to Judea. And he's saying to us that if the Jews knew that the Persians were going to be defeated by the Greeks, Persians might not treat the Jews so very well, that because they had this prophecy. Just don't tell us any bad news. That's kind of what he is relating to us. Shut it up, for it shall be for many days. It was about 300 years from the time of this vision to the time of the accomplishment of it. Therefore, he must shut it up for the present, even from the people of the Jews, lest it should amaze and perplex them. But let it be kept safely. For them it would be both most intelligible, let it be kept safely for the generations to come that should live about the time of the accomplishment of it. For to them it would be both most intelligible and most servable. Thought being that maybe 300 years from now God would give the explanation to the Jews who would be living through this. So what he saw in the vision, and what he could understand of what he saw, and the fact that he could not talk about what he saw to anyone else, made Daniel sick. Made him so sick, he could not go to work for several days. In closing, Matthew Henry says about this, the care he took to keep it private, having received such a charge, he fainted and was sick, with the multitude of his thoughts within him occasioned by this vision, which oppressed and overwhelmed him the more because he was forbidden to publish what he had seen, so that his belly was as wine which has no vent. He was ready to burst like new bottles. However, he kept it to himself, stifled and smothered the concern he was in, so that those he conversed with could not perceive it. But he did the king's business according to the duty of his place, whatever it was. So ends the prophecy of the ram and the male goat.